Three bars.
Good evening.
I should follow them around.
I'm Paul Lucas, the director of the Center for Humanities, which sponsors the Humanities Symposium. The Humanities Symposium at Loyola is now in its 26th year, and it exists to bring students and faculty from across the university, especially across the different departments in the Humanities Division, together to read and think about and discuss a common text. The idea behind the symposium 26 years ago was to show students, and I would add to remind faculty, that important books and important ideas do not belong to single academic departments or disciplines. We need academic departments in order for the university to run efficiently, but we do not need academic departments to define what is and what is not an idea's worth or value. That's because important books and ideas do not cross disciplines so much as evade them. They belong to us as thinking human beings, not as majors in a department or professors in this or that specialty or this or that area of expertise. In this vein, it's worth remembering how Ralph Waldo Emerson, Thoreau's mentor, defined a scholar, particularly an American scholar. He or she is, he said, man thinking, not man expert, or man master, or man in charge, but just, as if it were an easy thing, man thinking. Loyola's Humanities Symposium celebrates that, no more and no less. We change the book for the symposium every year. This year, as you all know, is Thoreau's Walden. And we conclude the symposium each year with a lecture by a distinguished guest. And this year, that guest is Professor Jeffrey Stout from Princeton. Looking over a summary of his career to date, I really can't imagine a better choice. That's because he embodies the spirit of the symposium. A professor of religion, he is at the same time associated with the departments of philosophy and politics, and with Princeton's Center for Human Values. His teaching, then, is not confined by discipline.
718.
Nor is his writing.
718.
Professor Stout is the author of books that sound theological. For example, The Flight from Authority, Ethics After Babel. And political. For example, Democracy and Tradition. And sociological. Blessed are the organized. Grassroots Democracy in America. With Robert McSwain, he edited a volume that seems to bridge the disciplines of religion and philosophy. It's titled Grammar and Grace, Reformulations of Aquinas and Wittgenstein. He writes about cinema. He has blogged about current events for the Huffington Post. His essays have appeared in such journals as Soundings, The Monist, New Literary History, the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, and the Journal of Religious Ethics. It's pretty clear this is a man thinking. He also has been a man doing. In his teens and 20s, he was active in both the civil rights and the anti-Vietnam War movements. He graduated from Brown University and received his doctorate from Princeton. When at Brown as an undergraduate, he chaired a student strike, ran the Rhode Island Draft Information Center, and founded Issues, a journal of opinion. At Princeton, he chaired the Department of Religion, and served as an assistant coach of the men's soccer team, and co-sponsored the faculty resolution on divestment in support of the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. He will talk to us this evening about the book and the ideas that we have all been grappling with over the last few days, especially, or specifically, about walking in our sleep, conformity and transformation in Thoreau's Walden. It's a real pleasure to give you Professor Jeffrey Stout.
Hello everyone, how are you? Good. What a wonderful opportunity to talk about a book that on every page and every sentence demonstrates concern for the most important things. Can everybody hear me? Good. I'm trying to advance this, it's not advancing. Okay, what I'm going to talk about today is a list of 5 questions. I'm going to give my answers to the questions. I have to say in advance that they're my answers. I offer them in a tentative spirit. I wouldn't offer them if I didn't think they were true. But part of what I'm going to talk about is the difficulty of the book. And if I'm right about the difficulty of the book, I ought to be tentative in my answers to the other questions. So the first question of the 5 that I'm going to hope to answer by the end of this talk is what the topic of the book is. I think there's actually a cluster of topics. I'm going to highlight 1 or 2 of them. I'm going to try and answer the question of aims. What are Thoreau's purposes in writing the book? Why did he write it in the way he did? Next, I'm going to ask, what audience is he addressing? He gives a few answers to that question directly in the book, and I'm going to highlight a particular answer that I think is relevant. What is he saying about the topic? That's the 4th question. What claims does Thoreau want to make about this, the topic of the book? And finally, by what means does he attempt to achieve his aim? How does he as a writer go about trying to achieve his aim? It's an extremely written book. He talks about wanting to live deliberately, and as one of the symposiasts today said, he writes deliberately. One of the things we're going to have to deal with in dealing with Walden is why he writes in the particular deliberate way he does. What does that have to do with his aims, his conception of the audience? So how shall I go about offering my answers to these questions? I'm going to do 3 things. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at 2 sentences about awakening in the 2nd chapter of Walden, where I lived and what I lived for. Then I'm going to consider a lecture about awakening that Thoreau, pardon me, I should say I have an allergy to cold, literally, and that means that the little trip from the theology department here cost me some of my voice, so it will get better as I go. So the second thing I'm going to do is to consider a lecture that Thoreau heard immediately after graduating from Harvard. Okay. So lecture about awakening. We're going to think a little bit about the significance of that lecture in his life. I think it was a moment of awakening in his life. And it was a lecture that partly had to do with the difference between being asleep and awakening, which turn out to be central themes in Walden. And third, I'm going to turn to 7 more sentences in Walden. And this is a passage about sleepers in the 2nd chapter of Walden. So by the end of the lecture, we will have mastered a little bit, a total of 9 sentences in all. And I'm hoping that the sentences are sufficiently well chosen that they will help us get an answer, a preliminary, tentative one, to the first 5 questions that I raised. Okay, let's get started. A sentence from chapter 2. It's one of the places where Thoreau states his aim, but it's a pretty difficult sentence. That is to say, he makes us do a lot of digging to figure out what the aim is. Why is he making us do the digging? He says, first, what he isn't going to do. I do not propose to write an ode to dejection. What's an ode? An ode is a kind of poem that is written in praise of something. He's not going to give us a poem that's in praise of dejection, despair, despondency. Why did I underline ode to dejection? He is referring to, for readers who are familiar with the literary background of his text, he is alluding to, without explicitly mentioning, allusion. He is alluding to Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Dejection, an Ode of 1802, which includes the line, "'Tis midnight, but small thoughts have I of sleep. Visit her, gentle sleep." Who is she who is to be visited in Coleridge's poem? It's Sarah Hutchinson. Coleridge is, at this point in his life, he's been married since 1795. It's not a happy marriage, and he's in love with another woman, Sarah Hutchinson. The poem is to her. And he's experiencing considerable dejection over his current condition. And we're not sure exactly when he took to drug use, and we're not sure whether this dejection led to the drug use or the drug use led to the dejection, but Coleridge was famous by Thoreau's period as an opium eater. He was also well known for changing his mind in extremely important ways about politics. So at the time of the French Revolution, and in the years immediately after it, he was a very ardent supporter of freedom as the French revolutionaries understood it. And by the time we get to 1802, he has turned his back on that, and he is thinking in a very different way about political society. In fact, he is arguing that an aristocracy and a monarchy are needed, and he's arguing that the vote ought to be limited to people who hold property. This is not Thoreau's politics. And dejection is the last thing he wants to write a poem in praise of. In fact, he thinks that the young people of his generation and below, so the young people who are just coming of age at the time he's writing Walden, he thinks that they are in many ways caught up in a way of life and attitude toward life that essentially resembles the mode of life that, or the mood that's being expressed in Coleridge's poem. That's why he's addressing people who are living lives of quiet desperation. He thinks that mood and the politics of the time are related. I do not propose to write an ode to dejection, but to brag as lustily as Chanticleer in the morning standing on his roost, if only to wake my neighbors up. He wants to brag. This is a term that's not normally used to express approval of someone's activity. Bragging is usually thought of as a selfish, self-centered thing to do. But here is Thoreau saying that it's part of his aim in this book to brag. And he's going to do it lustily, which is to say, it's going to have his love and his body in it, and it's going to be vehement. It's going to fill up. It's going to fill up the cultural space. He's going to brag. So what's he telling here? He's telling us not going to do this one thing. He's going to do another. His style involves allusion, and his use of words like brag, he's going to be playing with normal expectations about what the words mean. In African American culture, what he's doing is called signifying. In feminist theory, it's called resignifying, which is to say, you take a term and you either alter that to which the term is usually applied, or you alter the expectations about what the implications of applying the term are, or both. And in this case, the normal implication about brag is being canceled. The normal negative implication. It's like when the first rapper said, "I'm bad." Taking a term in ordinary use and altering what it implies. Turning it into a term of approbation. What is Thoreau doing here? In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, there's a character called Chanticleer. Chanticleer's a cock, a rooster. And it's not accidental that the Canterbury Tale in which Chanticleer appears is a Canterbury Tale in which a reference is made to a peasant's rebellion. It's not time today to go into the details of what these allusions might imply. But what Thoreau is telling us is that he proposes to be the cock who wakes people up. That's the purpose of writing. And he's going to perform this act, right, in a bragging, lusty way. Right? Which is to say, part of his purpose is to make an example of himself as an awakener and as one who has, in order to awake others, has already had to wake up. Let's now take another sentence from Walden, chapter 2. Of course, what we already know is that someone who is writing sentences like the one we just looked at wants to slow us down as readers and wants to put us in a position of having to work at getting what he's up to. Now, why would he want to do that? If we as readers are not made active, then we're not going to wake up. We're not going to be doing what he wants us to do. His mentor, Emerson, talks about creative reading as the necessary corollary to genuinely creative writing. The reader is being asked to do something. This has everything to do with the difficulty of the text and why it is made difficult in order to make us act as readers. Another sentence. We must learn to reawaken and keep ourselves awake, not by mechanical aids. So notice, we, he uses the first person plural. In other words, he himself is included among those who must learn to reawaken and keep ourselves awake. He's not excluding himself. He's not saying that he is somehow exempt from this. He's not saying that once he's awake, he's going to remain awake. Everybody who undergoes the process of awakening will find themselves repeatedly falling back into a condition of sleep and needing to reawaken. And it's not going to be easy to keep ourselves awake. And notice that he shifts from, in the previous sentence we looked at, he was talking about performing the role of the rooster, already awake, now trying to wake others up, right? Now he's talking about the difficulty of keeping ourselves awake. So he's assuming that the readers who might have some chance of being awakened by his writing, right, and he himself now have difficult work to do of keeping themselves awake. And it's they themselves now have the responsibility to be awake and to do what it takes to learn to be awake. Something is happening here. Not by mechanical aids. Well, this is a double allusion, another allusion to Coleridge. Coleridge had, in his work on Shakespeare, contrasted organic with mechanical style. He was praising Shakespeare for his organic style, which is to say, finding a style that coheres with the values and purposes of the writing, and making it be an organic relation between those two. So Coleridge made that distinction in praising Shakespeare, but he also wrote this book, Aids to Reflection, and you see the word aids appearing in both places, which from Thoreau's point of view must have seemed mechanical, which is to say, here's what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to give you a rule book like Coleridge's that will tell you how to live. So I'm not going to give you mechanical aids, a set of rules, the application of which to your life is going to settle the questions of how to live for you. That's exactly what I do not want to do. So the organic style that would be chosen for me as someone who has distinct aims from that has to be unlike a manual. It has to be unlike a rule book. But by an infinite expectation of the dawn, which does not forsake us even in our soundest sleep. So he's saying that even when we're most asleep, even when we're least conscious of what's going on with us, there is somehow implicit in our lives an infinite expectation of the dawn. What's that? There's some kind of gap, even at our unconscious, unhappiest, there's some kind of gap between the way we think things ought to be and the way things seem to us in our actual life. If we didn't have some awareness of that gap, we wouldn't be living in quiet desperation. We wouldn't be as unhappy as we actually are. So in our very unhappiness, there is an implicit expectation of the dawn. And provided that we don't commit suicide, that should pull us forward. It does not forsake us even in our soundest sleep. That word sound and sleep will be paired a little later. Okay. I'm now moving into the second part of my lecture. I said there would be three parts. The first would deal with 2 sentences from chapter 2. The second would have to do with a lecture that Thoreau attended right after leaving Harvard. The lecture was at Harvard. He had just graduated. He's not the first to use this metaphor of sleep and awakening. He borrows it and sharpens it. And some of you were at a symposium where this sentence was discussed today. From chapter 1, near the end of March 1845, I borrowed an axe and went down to the woods by Walden Pond. It is difficult to begin without borrowing. The owner of the axe, as he released his hold on it, said that it was the apple of his eye, but I returned it sharper than I received it. Well, one of the things he's saying, one of the many things he's saying in this passage, I think, is that the central metaphor of Walden, the metaphor of sleep and awakening, is something he's borrowed from somebody else. The scholars disagree over, they're uncertain about who supplied the literal axe that he's referring to. Right? But the metaphor, the central metaphor in the book comes from his mentor, Emerson. And it comes from the lecture that Emerson delivered that Thoreau experienced as a young man. And that lecture was the very one that Paul referred to in introducing the American Scholar. 1837. Thoreau would have looked even younger than that at the time he heard the lecture. At this point, Emerson was already a pretty significant figure in New England. And I just wish I could have been there looking back and forth between Emerson at the lectern and Thoreau in the room, having his world rocked by this lecture. Is there any chance that I can do that for you? Well, we'll see. What is it to be asleep? What would it be to wake up? So here's a little bit of what Emerson said. Men, such as they are, very naturally seek money or power, and why not? For they aspire to the highest, and this in their sleepwalking, they dream it is the highest. Wake them, and they shall quit the falsehood and leap to the truth. What's this mean? So it's natural to seek money or power. Money and power are both goods. You probably want some money and power. Power is just the capacity to achieve some objective of yours, right? Especially against opposition from others. Who doesn't want some of that? If you have objectives, I hope you have objectives. You want some power to achieve them. You don't want to be completely disempowered. And money's not a bad thing. Money's good. It's natural to want good things. But now the question is whether money and power are wanting those, whether that's the same thing as aspiring to the highest. And Emerson is saying that people in their sleepwalking dream that what he elsewhere in the passage calls the spoils of office, and that means the spoils of holding office as a teacher. He's talking about the American scholar. He's addressing people who are probably going into teaching. Thoreau is one of those people. Thoreau is about to take over Concord Academy, where he went to prep school, and he's going to spend the next years of his life running that academy. It's a little like taking over a charter school and trying to make it work. He's going to this lecture to find out what Emerson thinks that vocation is about, and Emerson's kind of shaking him up. He's saying, you want the money and power to accomplish something. Have you really thought about what holding that office will involve? What else does he say? From the lecture's final paragraph, the peroration, the point at which Emerson is really trying to inspire these young men. How does he address them? These young Harvard men who are trying to think about what scholars are in America, teachers, scholars. What's he say? He says, young men of the fairest promise, who begin life on our shores, shined upon by all the stars of God, find the earth below not in unison with these. So the stars of God must be a metaphor for their ideals. Young men of the fairest promise, people like you whom I'm addressing, he's saying, find this discord between ideals and the way things are actually going on earth below, but are hindered from action by the disgust which the principles on which business is managed inspire, and turn drudges or die of disgust, some of them suicide. Emerson thinks that Emerson, and I'm about to say Thoreau too, is always writing mainly with young people in mind. And his assessment of their mood and condition is that they are at least half aware that they are entering an adulthood that has major trouble in store for them. That the objective conditions that they are entering are conditions to which despair, despondency, quiet desperation are not completely unreasonable responses. And what this passage is telling us is that they're aware of ideals. That's the eternal expectation of the dawn. There's a gap between those ideals and earth below, that this has something to do with the principles on which business is managed. That you enter businesses, whether you're running Concord Academy, whether you're running a farm, whether you're running a shop, whether you're participating in the railroad, whatever it is, you're participating in an economy that has real difficulties in store for you and your soul. And it is not unreasonable to respond to the principles by which that economy runs with disgust. And that many people are responding to the intuitive future they face as young people entering adulthood. It's not ridiculous for them to recoil. And after recoiling, to begin to put themselves into a position of quiet desperation, quieting the disgust. Maybe they end up suicides if they go in the wrong direction. But maybe they just find a way of dealing with it. Coping. Transforming themselves into somebody who no longer feels the disgust. Dropping the ideals. A few words about Emerson's, a couple of Emerson's writings after that lecture. I should say, Thoreau comes up to Emerson after the lecture and introduces himself to him, right? And pretty soon they're friends, and before too long, Thoreau moves into the Emerson's house and takes care of the kids and does odd jobs. During part of that time, he's still running the Concord Academy. And then at a certain point, he decides to move out and begin his experiment at Walton Pond on Emerson's property. Maybe with his literally borrowed axe, we're not sure. In 1842, Emerson writes Self-Reliance, and this crucial sentence appears in it: the virtue in most request, and he's using the term virtue, ironically. The virtue in most request is conformity, self-reliance is its aversion. What's he mean? There's a biblical echo here, which in my view is central to understanding Emerson's work. And it's this passage from Romans 12:2. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. So what's conformity, and how do we fall into it? Conformity is, so how do you